People have lost interest in everything, and I want to tell you what that is a sign of, because I have been getting this wrong for years, and so I think as almost everybody else. For over 2 decades, there was a finding in the research on human happiness, so consistent that it was reproduced in more than 600 published papers across 145 countries, in rich nations and poor ones alike. Happiness was U-shaped across a life, high when you are young, sinking to its lowest point around 50, then rising again. The midlife crisis, measured and confirmed, that curve has vanished, not been questioned, vanished. Blanchflower and Bryson published it in PLOS One in August of 2025, using data going back to 1973. The U-shape is gone, replaced by a straight line, and here is why. It did not disappear because middle age got better. It disappeared because the left arm collapsed. Young people are now reporting the worst mental health of any adult age group, and the break began around 2013, which means the oldest people surveyed are now reporting the highest well-being of anyone. Something is happening, and it is not what you think. A finding reproduced 600 times just stopped being true. Let me start with the research itself, because I do not think most people appreciate quite how strange this is. In 2008, David Blanchflower at Dartmouth and Andrew Oswald at Warwick published work describing a pattern in well-being across the human lifespan. It went on to become one of the most reproduced results in the whole of social science. The shape was a U. You are relatively happy in your 20s. Life satisfaction declines steadily through your 30s and 40s. It bottoms out somewhere around age 50. And then remarkably, it climbs again and keeps climbing into old age. The mirror image showed up in the unhappy measures too. Stress, worry, anxiety, depression, all of them formed a hump, peaking in midlife and easing afterwards. Now, I want you to appreciate how solid this was. Over 600 published papers, data from 145 countries, present in developed nations and developing ones. Consistent across life satisfaction, happiness, stress, and worry as separate measures, and persistent over time, decade after decade. In social science, you almost never get that. Most findings wobble. This one did not. If you had asked me 2 years ago to name something we genuinely knew about human beings, I would have named this. And then Blanchflower and his colleagues went back to the data and found it had gone. The paper is in PLOS One, published on the 27th of August 2025 by Blanchflower, Alex Bryson at University College London, and Xu. The title tells you the whole story. The declining mental health of the young and the global disappearance of the unhappiness hump shape in age. A separate paper, using Eurobarometer data across 21 Western European countries going back to 1973, found the same thing. In 13 Northern European countries, including Britain, Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Switzerland, the U-shape has been replaced by life satisfaction that simply rises with age. Rises, all the way up. And Blanchflower has been quite direct about what happened. As he put it, from around 2013, the U-shaped pattern suddenly starts to disappear. It is not that the pattern we saw was wrong. It changed. Now, this is the part that stopped me. The curve did not flatten because middle age improved. Nobody fixed the midlife crisis. It flattened because the left arm fell down. Young adults, and particularly young women, have been doing dramatically worse since the mid-2010s, which means that the shape of a human life, as measured across dozens of countries and millions of survey responses, has been redrawn within about a decade. And it was redrawn by something that happened to the young. I have been thinking about this for weeks, because if you are in your 60s like I am, this finding says 2 things at once, and they point in completely opposite directions. It says that whatever you are feeling right now is probably rather better than you assume. And it says that something has gone very wrong for your children and your grandchildren. I want to be honest about my first reaction to reading it, because it was not a noble one. My first reaction was relief, pure uncomplicated relief, because I had spent a good 3 or 4 years quietly wondering whether something was wrong with me, and here was a paper in a peer-reviewed journal saying that people of my age are on the measures doing better than any other adult group in the country. I did not expect that. I had assumed in the way we all assume that the trajectory of later life was downward, and that the job was to manage the decline gracefully. That is certainly the story we are told. Every advertisement aimed at somebody my age is about mitigating something. And the second reaction, which took a few days to arrive, was rather less comfortable. If we are the happiest group being measured, and we are living through a period that most people describe as difficult, then either we are unusually resilient, which I doubt, or the difficulty is landing on somebody else. It is landing on somebody else. It is landing on people in their 20s, and it has been for a decade, and I did not notice because my own life got quieter and better at exactly the moment theirs got worse. That is an uncomfortable thing to sit with, and I have not entirely finished sitting with it. People over 60 are now the happiest group being measured, which surprised everyone. Let me stay with the good half of this for a while because I think a lot of you need to hear it and nobody is saying it. Across the 6 most populous English-speaking countries, John Twenge and Blanchflower found that since 2020, happiness and life satisfaction now rise steadily with age, rather than dipping and recovering. The oldest respondents in these surveys are reporting the highest well-being of any adult age group. And they are doing it, as one summary of the work put it rather nicely, in the middle of a decade nobody would describe as calm. Sit with that for a moment. We have had a pandemic, an inflation shock, wars, political turmoil, and a general sense that everything is coming apart, and the people reporting the greatest life satisfaction through all of it are the ones in their 60s and 70s. Now, I want to be fair, because there is an obvious objection, and it deserves an answer. You could reasonably say that older people are simply better at telling a survey they are fine. Life satisfaction is a summary judgment, and summary judgments are easy to launder. We are of a generation that was raised not to make a fuss, and I include myself in that. That objection is real, and I cannot fully dismiss it. But the researchers found the same pattern across multiple different datasets and multiple different question types, including measures of specific negative feelings rather than overall judgments, and it holds, so I do not think it is simply politeness. I think something else is going on, and it is the thing I have been noticing in my own life without having the words for it. You stop chasing. When I was in my 30s, an enormous amount of my satisfaction depended on the next thing. The next promotion, the next car, the next holiday, the next milestone, and each one worked, for a while. That is the whole trouble with it. It genuinely does work, briefly, which is what keeps you doing it. Psychologists have a name for this, and it is one of the most useful ideas I have ever come across. Hedonic adaptation, or the hedonic treadmill. The finding is that after almost any change in circumstances, positive or negative, people tend to drift back towards their previous baseline of well-being. You get the new car, you are delighted. And within a few months it is simply the car, and you are looking at a different one. That is not a character flaw. It is how the nervous system works, and it is quite sensible from an evolutionary point of view. An animal that stayed permanently delighted by the last good thing would stop looking for the next one. But it has an obvious implication that took me 40 years to notice. If you build your life around the arrival of new things, you have built it on a treadmill, and treadmills go nowhere by design. What appears to happen to a lot of people somewhere between 40 and 60 is that they simply get off, not through wisdom particularly, through exhaustion, or repetition, or having tried enough of the things to notice the pattern. And the data now suggests that getting off the treadmill is associated with the highest well-being of any point in a human life. Which is not what any of us were told when we were young. What you call losing interest might actually be your judgment improving. So let me put a rather different frame on the thing that worries people, because I think the language we use for it is doing real damage. When somebody says they have lost interest in everything, what has usually happened is much more specific than that. They have lost interest in a particular category of thing, and they have not yet noticed what replaced it. Let me be concrete about my own experience, because generalities are useless. I no longer care about acquiring things. Genuinely. If you offered me a new car tomorrow, my main thought would be about the paperwork and where I would put the old one. 20 years ago, that would have been unthinkable to me. I would have been thrilled. I no longer particularly want to go out in the evening. I would rather be at home. For years, I assumed that meant something was wrong with me, because socializing is supposed to be good for you, and I was choosing not to do it. I no longer find shopping enjoyable in any form. Wandering around a shopping center now strikes me as an odd way to spend a portion of a finite life. Now, the natural reading of all that is decline, withdrawal, something switching off. But look at what has actually happened underneath it. Because when I paid proper attention, I found something quite different. I have become dramatically more interested in a small number of things, and much more interested in them than I ever was in the things I gave up. I have become genuinely fascinated by how this channel works. Not in a vain way, I hope, in a craft way. Why one title works and another does not. How pacing affects whether somebody stays. What makes a thumbnail honest and still compelling. That is a real intellectual interest, and it did not exist 5 years ago. I have become interested in learning things properly rather than superficially, which is the opposite of what I did in my 30s when I collected experiences at speed and retained almost none of them. I have become interested in a handful of people, deeply rather than a large number of people, thinly. So when I say I have lost interest in everything, that is simply not accurate. What has happened is that my interest has become concentrated rather than dispersed, and because the things it is concentrated on are quiet, they do not feel like interest in the way that excitement felt like interest. That is the confusion, and I think it is at the heart of why so many people in our age group are worried about themselves. We were taught to recognize interest by its intensity. The buzz, the anticipation, the wanting. And so when the buzz goes, we conclude that the interest went with it, when what actually happened is that interest quietly changed its clothes. There is a useful distinction here that I have found genuinely clarifying. Wanting and liking are not the same system, and researchers who study this have shown they can be separated. Wanting is the pursuit, the reaching, the anticipation. Liking is the actual enjoyment of the thing once you have it. Young life is heavy on wanting, and wanting is loud. It produces restlessness, planning, and a great deal of noise. Later life, if it goes well, seems to shift towards liking, and liking is quiet. It does not announce itself. You do not get restless before a good cup of coffee. You simply enjoy it, and then it is over. So a person moving from a wanting heavy life to a liking heavy life will experience it as everything going silent, and will very reasonably conclude that something has been lost. But you have not lost the music. You have stopped listening to the drums. Let me give you a small test of this that I tried on myself and found rather revealing. Think of something you genuinely enjoyed in the last week. Not something impressive. Something small and ordinary that you actually enjoyed while it was happening. Now ask yourself how much you looked forward to it beforehand. When I did this, the answer for almost everything on my list was not at all. I did not anticipate the coffee on the bench by the river. I did not spend the morning looking forward to the conversation I ended up having with my wife about nothing in particular. The good bits of my week arrived without warning, and I enjoyed them fully, and then they were over, and I did not think about them again until I deliberately went looking. Whereas at 35, I could have told you precisely what I was looking forward to, weeks in advance, in detail, and I could not have told you much about the ordinary Tuesday I had just lived through. That is the whole shift in a nutshell. The enjoyment did not decrease, the anticipation did. And because anticipation is the loud part, the visible part, the part that makes you feel alive in a way you can point at, its absence reads as absence generally. There is one genuine loss in this, and I do not want to pretend otherwise, because I think honesty is worth more than reassurance. Anticipation is enormously useful for making time feel longer. A trip you have been looking forward to for 6 weeks occupies 6 weeks of your mental life, not 4 days. That is why childhood summers felt endless. Half of it was the waiting. So when anticipation fades, the years do genuinely speed up, and that is a real cost of contentment that nobody mentions. The peace is lovely, and the calendar empties faster. Which is why I have started deliberately putting things far enough ahead to lean towards, not because I need more excitement, because I want the weeks in between to have some shape to them. It is a small piece of engineering on a mind that no longer does it automatically, and it works. Before we go further, here is how to tell the difference between contentment and something serious. Now I want to stop and be careful, because I have just spent several minutes reassuring you, and there is a version of this where that reassurance does harm, and I would not forgive myself for that. There is a genuine clinical condition called anhedonia. It means the loss of the ability to feel pleasure, and it is one of the core symptoms of depression. It is not the same thing as becoming more selective about what you enjoy, and confusing the two is dangerous in both directions. So let me try to draw the line as honestly as I can, and I want to say plainly that I am not a doctor, and this is not a diagnosis. It is a set of questions worth asking yourself. The first question is whether you have replaced anything. Contentment is subtractive but not empty. You dropped the shopping, and the late nights, and the acquiring, and something else moved into that space. A garden, reading, grandchildren, walking, a craft, a channel, about time, something, and hedonia is subtractive with nothing arriving. The things go, and the space stays empty, and nothing has become interesting instead. If you genuinely cannot name a single thing you look forward to or find absorbing, that is worth taking seriously. The second question is about the small pleasures. I have lost interest in a great many large things. I have not lost interest in a good cup of coffee, or the first proper day of spring, or a hot bath, or a decent meal, or the sound of rain when I am indoors and warm. If the small pleasures have gone flat as well, if food tastes of nothing and a warm bath is simply water and music does not land, that is a different phenomenon entirely from becoming discerning. The third is whether it came with company. Contentment tends to arrive alone, and it feels rather peaceful. Depression usually brings friends, sleep that will not come right, either too little or far too much, appetite that has changed, a heaviness in the body, difficulty concentrating on things you could previously manage easily, waking at 4 in the morning with a sense of dread, and a particular kind of self-critical thinking that runs on a loop. If several of those are present alongside the loss of interest, please talk to your doctor. Not eventually. This week, the fourth is about time. Becoming selective is a gradual thing. Mine started in my 40s and took 20 years, and I only noticed it in retrospect. If your loss of interest arrived over a few weeks or months, if there was a before and an after, that is a change rather than a development, and changes have causes worth finding. And the fifth question is simply how it feels. I want to be very direct about this because I think it is the most reliable test any of us have. Contentment feels like relief. Genuinely. It feels like putting down something heavy you had been carrying without noticing. The other thing feels like loss. It feels like something was taken. If you are watching this and it feels like relief, I think you are probably fine, and I hope this video is useful to you. If it feels like loss, please go and see somebody. Depression in older people is very frequently missed, partly because we are of a generation that does not complain, partly because the symptoms get put down to age, and partly because it can present as flatness rather than sadness. It is also extremely treatable, which is the part that gets lost. There is no dignity in enduring something that a conversation, and if needed, a treatment could lift. I say that as somebody who has watched people in my own family get that wrong for years. The same symptom means the opposite thing in a 20-year-old. Right. Now I have to turn to the difficult half of this, because the research does not stop at good news for us, and I am not going to pretend it does. The U-shape did not vanish because we got happier. It vanished because the young collapsed. Blanchflower's finding is that ill-being no longer humps in the middle. It now declines steadily with age, which is another way of saying that the youngest adults are reporting the worst mental health of anyone. Young adults between 18 and 25 have been doing markedly worse since the mid-2010s, and the deterioration has been sharpest among young women. And here is the thing I keep coming back to, which is why I wanted to make this particular video. If a person in their 60s tells you they have lost interest in everything, the evidence suggests that is very often discernment. They have tried the things and made their choices. If a person of 22 tells you exactly the same sentence, using exactly the same words, it means something entirely different. They have not tried the things, they have not had the firsts, they have not worn out the treadmill through decades of running on it. They have arrived at the destination without making the journey, and arriving at contentment without having earned it is not contentment at all. It is flatness. That is what makes this genuinely alarming to me, and it is not a moral criticism of young people. Quite the opposite. Something has been done to them, because think about what the U-shape actually described. It described a life in which you begin with energy and appetite, spend your middle years grinding through obligations, and are rewarded at the end with peace. Whatever else you say about it, there was a logic to it. The hard part was in the middle, and it had a payoff. A straight line rising with age describes something quite different. It describes a life where the worst part is the beginning, and where the thing young people are being asked to endure is the age at which they are supposed to be building the memories that carry them. I have written before about how time speeds up when your days stop being distinguishable from one another. Well, consider what that means for somebody in their early 20s who is not going out, not traveling, not forming the relationships, not doing the firsts. The firsts are what anchor a life in memory. They are the reason your 20s feel long in recollection, and your 50s feel short. If a generation does not get the firsts, they will reach 60 with a much thinner store of the very thing that makes a life feel full. That is not a small problem. That is a problem that compounds for 40 years. And the honest reason I wanted to talk about this in a video ostensibly about our own contentment is that I think a great many of us have been quietly reassured by our own peace and have not noticed that our grandchildren are not on the same curve we were on. We assume they will get their turn. The data suggests the shape of the turn has changed. Everything seems to point at 2013, and nobody is entirely certain why. So what happened? Let me give you what the researchers actually say rather than what commentators say, because there is a difference, and it matters. The date that keeps appearing is around 2012 to 2013. That is when the pattern begins to break, and it breaks across multiple countries at roughly the same time, which is itself an important clue. Whatever caused it was not a national policy, because it happened in many nations with very different policies simultaneously. The default explanation is smartphones and social media, and Blanchflower himself has pointed at 2013 and the arrival of ubiquitous social media. That is when smartphone ownership crossed into near universality among the young and wealthy countries, and when the platform shifted from being places you visited occasionally to places you lived. He has also published on something related that I found genuinely sobering. He studied the long-term effects of childhood trauma, including bullying, and found that bullying has huge effects even 50 years later, affecting education, relationships, and earnings across an entire life. His point about cyberbullying follows naturally from that. Traditional bullying ended at the school gate. The current version does not end. It follows a child into their bedroom. It is witnessed by a much larger audience, and it is permanent in a way that a shouted insult never was. Now, I want to be careful here and say clearly that the causation is genuinely debated. Serious researchers disagree about how much of this is phones and how much is other things happening at the same time, and I am not qualified to settle it. What is not seriously disputed is the timing and the direction, and there are other candidates worth taking seriously. The economic position of young adults in most Western countries deteriorated over the same period. Housing became dramatically less attainable, wages stagnated relative to costs. The path from education to a stable job and a home of your own, which my generation could largely assume, became far less certain. Interestingly, the European research shows a nuance that supports this. In 6 southern European countries, including Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal, the pattern went the other way, and the life satisfaction of young people has been rising since around 2015. And the paper identifies a contributing factor, which is the rapid decline in youth unemployment since its 2015 peak. That is a rather important detail. Where the economic prospects of the young improved, their well-being improved with it, which suggests this is not purely about technology. There is also the simple loss of unstructured, unsupervised, in-person time. The gaps I have talked about before, the waiting, the loitering, the boredom that produces conversation and mischief and memory, that has largely been filled for the young by a device. And I would add one more that I have not seen discussed much, which comes from my own observation rather than from any study, so treat it accordingly. I think a generation raised watching curated versions of other people's lives may have skipped past a stage the rest of us went through. We had to actually try things to find out they were disappointing. We bought the car and discovered it did not fix anything. We went to the party and found it dull. That is how you earn the discernment that eventually becomes contentment. If you can watch 1,000 versions of an experience without having any of them, you may arrive at the disillusionment without the living. And disillusionment without experience is not wisdom. It is just being tired at 20. I could be entirely wrong about that, but it would explain why the symptom looks the same at both ends of life, while meaning such different things. There is one more possibility worth putting on the table, and it is the one I find hardest to dismiss. The U-shape may have described something that was never really about age at all. It may have described a particular arrangement of a life that happened to be common in the 20th century in wealthy countries. Think about what that arrangement looked like. You left school and got work fairly quickly. You could reasonably expect to afford a home in your 20s or 30s. You had children while you had the energy for them. The middle of your life was crowded and expensive and exhausting, which is exactly what produced the dip at 50. And then the children left. The mortgage finished, the pressure came off, and you got your rise. The dip was not caused by being 50. It was caused by being 50 and carrying a mortgage, 2 teenagers, aging parents, and a job you could not leave. If that is right, then what has happened is not that human nature changed. It is that the arrangement changed. Young people now carry costs and uncertainty at an age when my generation carried very little of either. Housing arrived late, or never. Work became less secure. The obligations shifted earlier in the life course, and if the burdens move earlier, the dip moves earlier with them. I find that explanation rather compelling, and it has one implication I would want to underline, because it is hopeful. It means this is not a permanent change to what human beings are. It means it is a change to the shape of the obligations we place on people, and obligations are arrangements, and arrangements can be rearranged. I do not say that to be glib. Fixing housing and employment for the young is an enormous undertaking, and it will not happen quickly. But it is a categorically different sort of problem from an irreversible change in the species, and I think it is worth knowing which of those we are looking at. I thought I had become antisocial, and I think I had simply become honest. I want to spend a bit of time on the social side of this because it is the one that causes people the most guilt, and I have carried a fair amount of it myself. Somewhere in my mid-50s, I noticed that I no longer wanted to go out. Not that I could not. I simply did not want to. An invitation would arrive, and my first internal response was to look for a way out of it, and then I would feel rotten about that response, and then I would go anyway and spend the evening wishing I were at home. For a long while, I assumed that meant I was becoming a miserable old so-and-so. That is certainly how it is described. You hear people say it about others. He has become a hermit. She never goes anywhere now. I have changed my mind about this entirely, and here is what changed it. I started paying attention to which invitations I dreaded and which I did not, and the pattern was completely consistent and had nothing to do with socializing as such. The ones I dreaded were the large ones. Rooms full of people, mostly acquaintances, where the conversation stays at the level of weather and holidays and what the children are doing. Where you have the same exchange 11 times in an evening and go home having said nothing you meant. The ones I looked forward to were small. 2 or 3 people. Long enough to get past the surface. Somewhere quiet enough to hear. So I had not lost interest in people at all. I had lost interest in a particular format of being around people, and because that format is what the word socializing usually means, I concluded I had gone off the whole business. Now when I look at this properly, I think there are 2 things going on, and both are worth naming. The first is simply arithmetic. When you are 25, meeting new people is enormously valuable because you do not yet know who your people are, and each new encounter might be one of them. The expected return on a room full of strangers is genuinely high. By 65, you already know. The people who matter to you have largely been identified over 4 decades, and the marginal value of a new acquaintance has fallen a great deal. It is not that new people have become worthless. It is that your existing relationships are now the ones with 40 years of depth in them, and an hour spent maintaining one of those is worth rather more than an hour spent starting from scratch. That is not misanthropy, that is a sensible allocation of a shrinking resource. The second thing is more uncomfortable, and I think it is true anyway. A great deal of the socializing I did in my 30s and 40s was not for enjoyment. It was for position, being seen, keeping up, not being left out. Making sure that if there was a room where things were decided, I was in it, and a certain amount of it was simple cowardice, because saying no felt like a risk I could not afford professionally. When that stops mattering, an enormous chunk of your social calendar turns out to have been obligation wearing a party hat. And here is where I want to add the necessary caution, because I have just spent several minutes justifying staying at home, and that is not the whole picture. There is a genuine and well-evidenced difference between solitude and isolation, and it is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. Solitude is chosen and it restores you. You come out of an afternoon alone feeling more like yourself. Isolation is not chosen, or it is chosen by default through a long series of small avoidances, and it depletes you. You come out of it feeling less like yourself and slightly worse about the world. And the trouble is that they look identical from the outside and can feel similar from the inside for quite a long time before the difference becomes obvious. So I use a rough test on myself and offer it for what it is worth. I ask whether there is anybody I would ring if something went genuinely wrong at 3 in the morning, not whether I have friends in the abstract, whether there is a specific name and a specific number. If that list has a couple of names on it, I think you can be as selective as you like about parties and lose nothing at all. If that list is empty, then the selectivity has gone past discernment into something else, and the fact that it happened gradually and for good reasons at every step does not change where you have ended up. I check that list about once a year. It takes 10 seconds, and it has twice prompted me to pick up the telephone to somebody I had let drift, which is the entire point of asking. My father went quiet at 70, and we all called it getting older. I want to tell you something personal now, because I think it is the most useful thing in this entire video, and because the research I have described made me see it differently. My father went quiet in his early 70s. He had been a sociable man. He had interests, opinions, a workshop he was always in, a group he met on Thursdays, and over the course of about 18 months it all thinned out. He stopped going to the Thursday thing. The workshop stayed tidy, which was the real sign, and none of us read it, because a tidy workshop meant nothing was being made. He would sit in the chair with the television on and not really watch it. And every single one of us, myself included, said the same thing. He is getting older. That is what happens. It was not what happens. He was depressed for years, and nobody said the word out loud because he was 73 and men of that generation did not have depression. They had a bit of a rough patch, and because we had a perfectly acceptable explanation available to us in the form of his age, the explanation was wrong, and it cost him time he did not have to spare. I have thought about that a great deal while reading this research, because the finding that older people report the highest well-being of any group is genuinely good news, and it also creates a specific risk. If the baseline expectation becomes that people in their 70s are content, then a person in their 70s who is not content becomes easier to miss, not harder. They look like the exception nobody is looking for. And the presentation in older people is frequently different from what families expect. Not weeping, not obvious sadness, flatness, withdrawal, irritability, physical complaints that do not resolve. A general going quiet that fits neatly under the heading of aging and therefore requires no further thought from anybody. So let me offer the questions I wish somebody had asked in my family. And I am not a doctor, and this is not a diagnosis, it is a list of things worth noticing. Has the workshop gone tidy? Whatever the equivalent is for the person in question. The garden nobody is digging. The sewing machine with no thread in it. The fishing rods that have not moved. Look for the activity that has stopped, rather than for a mood. Have they stopped initiating? A person can still answer the phone pleasantly and still have stopped ever being the one who rings. That change is enormously informative and almost invisible unless you go looking for it. Have they stopped complaining about things they used to complain about? This one sounds odd, and I think it is one of the most reliable. My father had opinions about everything, and when the opinions stopped, that was the signal. Engagement is engagement even when it is grumbling. Has their world got physically smaller, fewer rooms used, fewer journeys, a radius that is quietly contracted from the town to the street, to the house, to one chair, and has anybody actually asked them, properly, once without an audience, and then waited through the silence afterwards rather than filling it? I want to say one more thing about this and then I will leave it, because I am aware I have got rather serious and this is meant to be a video about contentment. The reason I keep coming back to it is that this video's whole argument is that losing interest is often fine, and that argument is true. And it is also exactly the kind of comfortable idea that lets a family not look too closely for another 18 months. So hold both. If it is you and it feels like relief, I think you are fine, and I hope this has given you some peace about it. If it is somebody you love and their world has been getting smaller, please do not accept getting older as the explanation. It was the explanation we accepted, and it was wrong, and I would give a good deal to have that time back. If this is the sign, here is what I think it is actually a sign of. Let me try to answer the question in the title properly now, because I have been circling it. People have lost interest in everything, and I think it is a sign of two things at once, depending entirely on who is saying it. For those of us past 60, I think it is a sign that the chase is over, and that this is what it was always supposed to feel like. Nobody warned us that peace would feel so much like nothing. We were sold excitement our entire lives, and then handed something quiet at the end of it, and told nothing about how to recognize it. The data now suggests this stage is the best-rated part of a human life, and most of the people living it are worried they are broken. For the young, I think it is a sign of something that genuinely needs fixing, and that it is not their fault, and that it will not fix itself. Now, what do you actually do with that? Because I do not want to leave you with a diagnosis and nothing else. For yourself, 3 things. The first is to stop mourning the things you have outgrown. Genuinely. If you no longer want to go to the pub, do not go to the pub and feel guilty about it. That guilt is the residue of a value system that was designed for a different stage of your life, and you are permitted to retire it. The second is to make sure you are actually replacing rather than only subtracting. This is the one I would emphasize most. Contentment that has nothing in it is not contentment, it is a vacancy, and vacancies fill themselves with unhelpful things. Have something you are learning. It does not matter in the slightest what it is. Bread, birds, a language, a craft, a machine, a piece of local history. The learning is the point, not the subject. And the third is to keep the anticipation alive in small doses. A day out planned 3 weeks ahead does more for a month than the day itself does. That is not sentiment, it is how memory works. Give yourself something to lean towards. For the young people in your life, and this is where I would put most of your energy. 3 more. Give them firsts. Genuinely, this is the single most useful thing an older person can do. Take a grandchild somewhere they have not been. Teach them something with their hands, show them a trade, take them fishing or to a workshop, or on a train to a city they have not seen. You are not entertaining them, you are giving them the anchors that will make their life feel long when they are our age. Do not tell them your 20s were the best years of your life. I have caught myself doing this and I have stopped. To somebody struggling at 23, that sentence lands as, this is as good as it gets, and you are already failing at it. The research says the opposite is true, and you are in a position to tell them so honestly. Well-being now rises with age. Tell them that, and ask them properly. Not how are you? Which produces fine. Ask what they are looking forward to. If the answer is nothing, that is worth a longer conversation, and you may be the only person in their life with the time to have it. I will finish with the thing I keep turning over. I spent from about 20 until 44 believing that satisfaction was somewhere ahead of me, and that I would reach it by acquiring enough. I was wrong, and the correction took a long time and cost me a good deal. The finding that the shape of a life has changed does not frighten me for myself. At 65 I am, statistically and personally, doing rather well, and I suspect a good many of you are too, even if nobody has told you so. It frightens me for the ones coming behind. Because the U-shape, whatever its miseries, contained a promise. It said the hard middle passes, and something better waits. A straight line rising with age says something rather colder. It says the difficulty is front-loaded now, and that a young person has to survive a great deal before the good part begins. They will need us to say, clearly and often, that the good part is real. I can tell you it is. I am sitting in it. But somebody has to tell them, because at the moment the data says nobody has. What is your experience of this? Have you lost interest in things and worried about yourself, or have you noticed it in somebody younger? Please share it in the comments, because I read them and because somebody else will need to hear that they are not the only one. Thanks for watching. I will see you next time.